everyone. Welcome to the webinar. This is Kira Zegelman with NARUC. Sorry, we're starting a couple minutes late. We just had some technical issues getting one of our panelists online, but that should be resolved shortly. In the meantime, I just introduced the Carbon Capture, Utilization, and Storage Partnership. That's our grant with the Department of Energy that makes this webinar and other programs possible. So we serve as a resource for commissioners. We organize site visits, write papers, conduct webinars, and produce other resources for state commissioners and commission staff to better understand carbon capture technology and policy. So as part of this effort, I'm pleased to be working with the folks at the Great Plains Institute's State CO2-EOR Working Group. And with that, I will turn it over to Doug.
Thanks very much, Karen. Good afternoon, everybody. Appreciate you joining in with us. Doug Scott with the Great Plains Institute, former commissioner in Illinois. And this is the second webinar that we've done for the group. And the first one, if you remember, we focused on two white papers that the State CO2-EOR Working Group had done, one on incentives, both federal and state, that could enhance CO2-EOR projects. And the second on pipelines and the financing of pipelines and the economics surrounding them as they relate to CO2-EOR projects. We've done a third white paper. The working group has done a third white paper, this one on the markets and how CO2-EOR projects are affected by the markets under the theory that you may be able to get financing for your project, but you still need to be able to sell power into the competitive marketplace, and if you can't, then the economics may not work for your particular facility. So there's a third white paper that's been done, and in talking with Kira, she thought that it would be good to bring some folks on and talk about that white paper. I do want to also mention, though, before we get started with that on the incentive front, there is quite a bit of activity. There have been United States House and Senate bills that have been introduced that would do a lot of the work that with respect to tax incentives that were contemplated by the first white paper and also contemplated by the resolution that NARUC passed a couple of years ago, looking for federal incentives for carbon capture and oil recovery projects, so-called 45Q legislation. There are 25 sponsors and co-sponsors in the Senate on a very bipartisan basis, and the same bipartisan support list in the House, where I believe as of the last count there are 37 sponsors and co-sponsors. So it's a really good time to talk to your representatives and senators, and if they've not signed on to that legislation, it would be a great time to do that. And I think just talking from either the white paper or the NARUC resolution, there's plenty of information to be able to talk about why it's important to support those efforts. And of course, if you have any questions, feel free to contact us at the Great Plains Institute. We'd be able to be more than happy to help you with that. So I'm joined today to talk about the markets piece of this. We'll be joined by a really good panel of folks who not only have been working with the work group for quite some time and working on the white papers, but also on the national level, working on building up the coalitions to try to support carbon capture and enhanced oil recovery projects. So you're going to hear first from Matt Fry. Matt's in the governor's office, Governor Matt Mead's office in Wyoming, who has been one of the co-chairs of our State CO2-EOR Working Group, and Matt's done a great job. You heard from him on the last panel discussion that we had. Matt will be followed by Chairman Ted Thomas of the Arkansas Commission, who not only works really hard on this work group and the issues surrounding it, but also on any number of other initiatives throughout the country. And so we're really pleased to have Chairman Thomas with us today. And then my colleague at the Great Plains Institute, Brad Crabtree, who's our Vice President for Fossil Energy. And Brad has also been the person from the beginning facilitating the National Enhanced Oil Recovery Initiative, which is a national group of stakeholder group that's working to try to build up and get federal assistance for carbon capture and soil recovery projects. So you're really hearing from experts up and down the line here with respect to carbon capture and soil recovery. So again, thanks very much for being on. Thanks for the opportunity to present today. And with that, let me turn it over to Matt.
Thanks, Doug. I appreciate the opportunity today. As Doug mentioned, I'll talk a little bit about the history. If anybody can't hear me, obviously pipe up, but I'll talk a little bit about our history and the recommendations that we've come through in the past. So just a little background. Back a few years ago, when Governor Meade and Governor Bullock were the co-chairs of the Western Governors Association, they developed a resolution on EOR. This resolution got a pretty good amount of attention by those of us interested in this world of CO2-EOR. So as a result, the governors developed what we call the CO2-EOR Work Group, which is what we're here representing today. At this point, our work group contains membership from 14 different states, which are depicted on the map on the slide. We've also got leading industry and NGO representation, as well as some other CO2-EOR experts across the globe, across the country, excuse me. The objectives of the work group were pretty clearly spelled out by the governors. The first one was to help policymakers better understand the potential for CO2-EOR, kind of an educational thing. They also wanted us to recommend strategies and policies for states and federal government to help with deployment. Then they tasked us with supporting state policymakers and implementing these recommendations. So we don't just throw out ideas, but we actually try to get them on the ground. And then finally, they asked us to encourage federal policies that complement the state priorities. Next slide, please.
And Matt, I assume the slide presentation is working fine for everybody?
It is for me, yes. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay, thank you.
So this slide just kind of depicts the overall growing support for CO2-EOR across the states. I won't read through it. I assume that you all have these, but as you can see from the depictions on this slide, there's a growing interest and support both statewide and federally on this front. So we've got some real momentum now, and Doug talked about it a little bit earlier. So we're hoping we can ride that momentum to bring some of these recommendations to fruition. Next slide, please. So as he mentioned, and we talked about in our previous webinar, our first group of recommendations, our first work group product was the puzzle pieces paper. This was a significant paper, got a lot of attention, and it was basically the idea was to release both federal and state recommendations for implementation and deployment of CO2-EOR. The federal incentives were clearly laid out in the report. The first and most active one at this point was to extend, reform, and expand the existing Section 45Q tax. Doug just talked about that. So there's a lot of support both in the House and the Senate, as well as state, to get this thing moving forward. There's a lot of opportunity, and we are hoping that this makes it through and is passed this year. Our next recommendation was to establish federal price stabilization contracts, or contracts for differences for CO2 sold from capture facilities for CO2-EOR. And the last major recommendation on the federal side was to make carbon capture eligible for tax-exempt private activity bonds or master limited partnerships. We also, in this report, outlined some opportunities for states to further incentivize CO2-EOR. These were mostly tax-based, as new taxes aren't necessarily popular in most states. We just looked at opportunities to better utilize existing tax structures within states. Next slide, please. Our next work group product was the product on incentives for CO2 pipeline infrastructure. This is something that's fairly near and dear to my heart. One of my major responsibilities for Governor Meade is to develop a statewide CO2 pipeline corridor across the state of Wyoming. So these hit pretty close to home for us here in Wyoming. But some of the recommendations we came out with in this paper were to make CO2 pipelines a priority for the broader national infrastructure agenda. As I'm sure we've all heard in the news, there's a big discussion of infrastructure in this administration, and we wanted to bring the opportunity for CO2 pipelines to play a forefront role in this, and maybe take advantage of some of the opportunities that are being presented at this time. We also asked that we leverage private capital with federal financing for large volume, long distance trunk CO2 pipeline infrastructure. This is pretty important because as you're building these pipelines, if you just build them to the size that you need at the current time, it may be counterproductive. And as the report clearly identifies, to oversize these things is that tremendous of a capital expenditure above and beyond what you're planning. So we think it's pretty opportune and something we should look at for greater infrastructure corridors. And finally, we recommended support for CO2 pipeline planning and streamline permitting, which kind of plays a direct part into what we're doing in Wyoming with a CO2 corridor system. So with that, I will pass it on to Chairman Thomas to talk about the next slide.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. My interest in the work group basically originated in all of the dealings with the Clean Power Plan. What could we do when faced with those mandates? Because we didn't appear at the state level to have a lot of flexibility. And so what we wanted to try to do is think of any conceivable option that would give us policy alternatives as we watch different prices move. Really just an all of the above diversified approach to mitigate cost impact from federal carbon policy. In thinking about the CPP, also one of the most challenging issues with that was if you're in an RTO market, you'll have different rules in each state that have to be accommodated by the same RTO market if it consists of more than one state, which most of them, well, I guess all except, well, actually 4 do, 3 don't, including MISO, SPP, PJM, and the New England markets have more than one state. So in discussing this issue in terms of how difficult it is to get CPP accommodated in the RTO markets, it got folks thinking, and they wrote a paper which is first of the kind and available with the link on the side regarding electricity market design and carbon capture technology. Essentially, what we're trying to do is page 21 of the report shows a very good price chart that shows among the options in terms of carbon mitigation that carbon capture and enhanced oil recovery is very cost competitive, but it's difficult to get the cost advantage funneled in one direction because the policies are coming from more than one place. But still, like as compared to wind, it's much cheaper of a method, so that there should be some accommodation. And as Doug mentioned, and Matt mentioned as well, the Q45 bill, and in my view, subsidies allow scale up to measure competitiveness in an industry where scale wins and engineering improves operations when you're operable. You can't have a competition in a scale business where something is not scaled competing against scale, or will lose all the time. So a subsidy is a temporary measure that allows something to scale to see what's there, and it also allows operational experience, which gives engineers a chance to improve things. So the work group did this paper, it's linked there. And with that point, I will pass it to Brad.
Chairman Thomas, thank you. Appreciate you setting that context for this report, and Doug as well at the beginning. So one of the starting point for the work group is the basic objectives that they identified for managing our power system. And these aren't necessarily thought of in terms of legal authorities necessarily for a state commission, but the top three objectives that we all ought to consider in thinking about the management of our power system. So affordable and reasonable prices for consumers, system reliability, and environmental stewardship. And in that context, the group wrestled with what's really a two-pronged problem. One is that carbon reduction benefits are neither valued in the market nor explicitly addressed by public policy. And when you take those three objectives above, again, affordable and reasonable prices, system reliability, environmental stewardship, no single actor or policy mechanism is responsible for accomplishing all three in an integrated way. So those are kind of the starting point and key insights for this white paper. And here you see in the slide who regulates the overlap, just a kind of graphical representation of the problem. And I think it brings home that key insight. If you look at, on the environmental side, you have the EPA and state environmental agencies that have statutory responsibility for environmental regulation. And then you have a suite of institutions, including those, the commissioners on this call that you represent, responsible for reliability. And that, of course, includes the RTOs and ISOs, balancing authorities as well, and NARUC at the federal level. And then economic regulators, again, yourselves as state commissioners, but in this case, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and again, RTOs and balancing authorities. And it's that middle triangle and how we accomplish the integration of the three that is the challenge. The other point that the work group was keen to make, as Chairman Thomas pointed out, this is, we think, is a first ever paper on this particular topic, which is what is the policy and regulatory framework needed so that carbon capture equipped power plants can operate competitively and dispatch into wholesale markets. But at root, the challenges that a power plant with carbon capture faces are not fundamentally different from other dispatchable low and zero carbon power technologies. The key thing here is dispatchable. So you have geothermal, combined heat and power, solar thermal plants with heat storage, and of course nuclear, both existing and new. And so the work group was very intentional about putting this particular challenge in the broader context of how do we ensure the viability of dispatchable low and zero carbon generation more broadly. The other thing, of course, is just the basic insight that carbon capture plants can be built and operated in either regulated or competitive markets, but there are key differences in terms of how plants get built, how dispatch is determined, how retirements decisions are made, and then ultimately how they come under regulation at the federal level from system operators and from the states. The other key thing is that, and this is one of the challenges in that problem of different types of regulation at different levels not ever effectively overlapping, power plants with carbon capture have multiple benefits, but those benefits are never considered and valued comprehensively. And so the carbon capture, obviously you capture the CO2 rather than emit it. This has an environmental benefit, which is obvious, but it also has a commercial benefit for enhanced oil recovery, in some cases right now and more so in the future for chemical production and potentially other economically beneficial uses. Key here is you have a very low carbon generation source that is dispatchable and provides grid services. And that's a key distinction and something that's emphasized in this report. The other thing we talk about, existing infrastructure. Here's an example where we can take advantage of existing generation and other fossil fuel infrastructure that's already in many cases been paid for and still well within its economic life. And we can continue to make further economic use of it. And then the final point, which maybe deserves some emphasis because it gets lost very often in the public discussion, which is that carbon capture is not just a question of the benefits of reducing carbon emissions, CO2 emissions, but also in order to operate carbon capture systems effectively, you have to bring criteria pollutants, traditional environmental pollutants, down to very, very low levels. So by implementing carbon capture, it does not mean that you are committing to higher levels of other emissions. To the contrary, they can be part of a comprehensive approach to emissions reductions. This slide summarizes the policy recommendations from the report. At the federal level, and we decided again to show where they apply to all dispatchable low and zero carbon resources, as well as those that apply to carbon capture specifically. One of the key, most important things is that in order for a generator to be rewarded for installing carbon capture and reducing carbon emissions, there has to be a financial value provided in some fashion for those CO2 reductions in the context of generation dispatch. That does not necessarily mean carbon pricing. It could if jurisdictions wanted to pursue that direction, but it also could be affirmatively applying a value in generation dispatch to those facilities that are equipped that way, rather than penalizing those that aren't. Also, there's a real need, if dispatchability is to be rewarded, then we need more effective capacity payment structures that are financeable, that project developers can actually take to the bank and secure private investment in projects. And then, as I think most of you are aware, there's been budget proposals from the administration recently opposed by majorities in both houses of Congress to cut back on federal funding that runs through the Department of Energy's Office of Fossil Energy to support research, development, demonstration, and deployment. So the point there is that ongoing funding of a research and development sort will be needed in this area. Then at the federal level, with respect to carbon capture specifically, and this doesn't mean second priority, it actually is top priority among the group's recommendations, as Matt had communicated, is the extension and reform of the Section 45Q tax credit first and foremost. That is an absolute essential policy change that's needed to drive further commercial deployment of carbon capture in the power sector. In a important but complementary way would be extending eligibility of private activity bonds, as Matt mentioned, to carbon capture projects. Right now, they're not eligible. This in and of itself would not lead to new carbon capture projects, but if added to 45Q as a financing mechanism, would significantly increase deployment. And then you see other things like the master limited partnerships. Also, the state work group is recommending that the federal government play a financing role in the build out of significant pipeline infrastructure in regions that aren't currently served. And then I already talked about the RD, D&D programs. On the ISO RTO side, a low carbon capacity standard is, if we're going to value the dispatchability in grid services that carbon capture can provide as a low carbon generation option, then there has to be benefits in the capacity markets that are meaningful to those generators. And again, the need to provide value for the CO2 reductions that are achieved. And I should say on that particular point, one of the examples that was discussed by the work group, not to say that this is how states or regions could do it, but just an illustrative example, there has been an effort recently to provide value zero emissions credits for existing nuclear, to recognize the benefits that existing nuclear provides as a low carbon resource. And there's the potential to provide policy options that have that kind of value for power plants with carbon capture as well. Finally, on the state side, to modify or supplement existing renewable portfolio standards, Basically, with a few exceptions, state portfolio standards reward generation from an existing technology, mostly independent of emissions reductions or cost. And what the work group is saying is not that all states should have RPSs or portfolio standards that incorporate CCS, carbon capture, but for those states that do choose to have portfolio requirements, which more than half the states in the country do, they should move to modify those RPS or RES requirements so that they accommodate low carbon generation involving carbon capture, so that there's a state incentive for deployment as well. So I've covered most of these recommendations, but obviously the first priority, regardless, is to enact the federal level incentives that we've talked about. There is the infrastructure debate going on in Washington, as Matt mentioned, and to make sure that there's a federal component, both in terms of including CO2 pipelines, but also targeted financing, not to replace the role of the private sector, but to supplement it. Having FERC is already engaged, as many of you know, in these discussions with respect to nuclear and existing coal-fired generation. Carbon capture hadn't come up so much in the FERC context when this paper was released, but the issue of base load generation and its viability was heating up at the time. And I've talked about the RD&D programs and sustaining them at the federal level. At the RTO ISO level, again, implementing policy changes at the dispatch level that in capacity contract levels that value the services, emissions reduction, and dispatchability that carbon capture can provide. Also, though, considering longer-term financing by providing longer-term cost of service-based contractual mechanisms, because it's that longer term, these are large-scale capital-intensive projects that need to be financed. So the longer the term for the policy benefits, the more likely they will facilitate financing. And then the previous slide also covered expanding RPSs to include low and zero carbon non-renewable generation, or if there could be a separate low carbon generation standard or credit in parallel with an existing RPS if the state would find that politically or otherwise preferable. To summarize, we need to redouble the effort that's underway right now to get incentives for carbon capture enacted at the federal level, sustain R&D, work towards more comprehensive policies that include all dispatchable low and zero carbon options, market rules, incentives, portfolio standards, and at the federal, RTO, and state levels. So comprehensively and at all levels. And then again, improving energy and capacity markets so we have system flexibility in a ways that rewards low carbon dispatchable generation and the benefits they provide. So that's the report and the recommendations. And I guess we turn it over, Kara, to questions and discussion.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Brad. So folks on the webinar, you can use the either the questions box where you can type in a question, or you can raise your hand and I can unmute you and you can ask your question directly. While folks are thinking, I'll start it off. So the partnership, several commissioners and staff, some of whom are on the line now, just visited the Petronova facility outside of Houston. And so that facility, they really emphasize the importance of a number of state tax exemptions, a grant from the Department of Energy, a loan from the Japanese government, and the ability of the project to sell captured carbon dioxide to an oil field for enhanced oil recovery. So you mentioned other uses for captured carbon dioxide. Aside from enhanced oil recovery, what are some of those that are currently in use or close to being in use?
This is Brad. So as far as other uses, it's important to note right up front that the commercial utilization of CO2 for enhanced oil recovery is the largest beneficial use of economically beneficial use of CO2 to date, and the one that is most obviously scalable in terms of it being a broader energy and carbon reduction solution. That said, there is enormous commercial and creative interest, and environmental interest for that matter, in identifying other beneficial ways to utilize CO2. Those range from taking CO2 that's captured from a power plant or industrial facility and using it to make a product that does not result in emissions and perhaps avoids emissions. So a very concrete example, no pun intended, is to use captured CO2 in the making of concrete, so that you're substituting CO2 for the Portland cement that would otherwise be used to make concrete. The manufacture of Portland cement is a major source of CO2 in the world today. And so this would be an economically beneficial and environmentally sound alternative. There are other cases where R&D, and in some cases early commercial demonstration, is occurring where CO2 is used as a feedstock to produce other chemicals. Technically, there are a number of applications that are well known and understood for doing that. The challenges are in the energy required to synthesize CO2 into other components in chemicals and other products, and not having that energy penalty, both economically and environmentally, exceed the benefit. So that's where the R&D and the deployment is focused now. And then I guess the other area of promise is to use CO2 that's captured and then use that to produce another type of fuel. Now, there would still be emissions as a result, but you would at least be getting more energy production for a given amount of CO2. So using CO2 to actually produce alternative liquid fuels, there's a lot of effort underway in that area. Another area that's fruitful is using CO2 to feed algae production, basically accelerate the normal biological growth of algae in a controlled environment, and then using that algae to produce biofuels and other products. So those are just a few examples. And I should say the Section 45Q tax credit that we've been talking about, both the House and the Senate legislation, in addition to offering $35 a ton for CO2 stored through enhanced oil recovery, will offer entrepreneurs and project developers $35 a ton for CO2 that's beneficially utilized in other ways.
And this is Matt. I just speak for something, one of the initiatives going forward in Wyoming. We had a partnership between the state legislature, the governor, and private entities to establish the integrated test center which is a test center attached to one of our coal-fired power plants, where we're looking at opportunities to take that CO2 stream and utilize it for a product on the back end. Similar to what Brad mentioned, associated with that ITC integrated test center, there's an X Prize competition where the company or the entity that develops the best industrial use for this CO2 will be awarded a $20 million prize. So Wyoming's trying to lead in this initiative, not only from an EOR perspective, but as products as well.
Thanks. We had a question come in from Commissioner Oden, who's the chair of our subcommittee, on the 45Q tax credit language. He wanted to know if there's a specific congressman that he should direct his support of the bill to. I believe it's Senator Heitkamp is the lead sponsor of the bill in the Senate, but are there representatives as well?
Sorry, this is Brad Crabtree again. I was on mute. Yes, so maybe the best way to, first of all, Chairman Oden, thank you. The most helpful thing would be to reach out to your own senators and House members. There is both a Senate bill and a House bill. Senator Heitkamp is the lead sponsor on the Senate bill. Chairman Mike Conaway of the House Agriculture Committee representing West Texas is the lead sponsor of the House bill. I would be happy to provide to you, Kira, a list of the current co-sponsors for each of the bills, both their state they represent and their party affiliation, and that way your commissioners in your subcommittee could see who from their state isn't necessarily supporting the bill, and if they think there's an opportunity to reach out to them that they might be open to this kind of a policy. That would be the most helpful action, would be that the credibility of a commissioner from their own state contacting a member of their delegation.
Yeah, that would be a great resource. If you'd like to send that to me, I'll distribute it to the group. We had another question from Commissioner Johnson from Ohio. He wanted to know, what are the biggest state level hurdles to carbon capture projects? So this is also something that we discussed during our Petronova visit, and Commissioner Johnson was there. The two staff from NRG who addressed us talked a lot about the financial issues, the really sort of high upfront costs in getting the next project up and running. So we talked a little bit about, what specifically needs to be done in order to get more successful projects up. But could you speak to that a little bit, and specifically at the state level?
Matt, would you like to take that, or do you want me to take that?
Sure, I can talk about it from based on my experience here. Our biggest challenges are twofold, I guess. The first, as you mentioned, is the hurdle associated with the capital cost to implement or to build these projects. And then secondarily, we have a tremendous opportunity for EOR in the state, but what we lack is the infrastructure to get the CO2 from the source to the sink. So as I mentioned previously, I think that certainly the capital is a big problem, but we're deeply lacking in the infrastructure to make this implementable, not only within our state, but on a national level.
Kara, could I just add one more thing to what Matt said that I think maybe would be helpful for state policymakers to think about?
Oh, yes, go ahead.
So one of the challenges, and Matt was quite right, the capital costs are high for these projects. And so it would be very challenging for a state on its own, absent federal action, to provide a state policy with enough value to lead to new commercial carbon capture projects, especially in the power sector where the technology is now commercially deployed, as you saw at Petronova in Texas, but there are only 2 examples commercial scale in the world today. And so there's a lot of work to be done yet to bring down the costs. And so where the state, what we most need is federal action on at least the 45Q tax credit. That would provide $35 a ton to a company in your state to capture the CO2. Right now, about $15 a ton is a useful, reasonable estimate of what a generator would receive for selling CO2 to an oil company. That will vary a little bit around the country, but there you're getting the total value up to around $50 a ton. And so then with those 2 sources of revenue, a federal policy in place and selling the CO2 for enhanced oil recovery, then it becomes plausible for a state to think systematically about how its tax policy, maybe modifying a renewable portfolio standard, other types of things that could be each contributing a little bit that could make up that final remaining difference for a project to be viable. And so one of the things that state policymakers could be thinking about is how to make their state policy frameworks, call it carbon capture ready, so that when there is a federal tax credit in place, states are positioned to take advantage of it and see projects happen.
Mm-hmm. And one additional question for me. So you mentioned the ability of RPSs to include and incentivize carbon capture. Could you talk somewhat about what role public utility commissions play in implementing that, in helping states achieve those RPS goals?
That might be one that Chairman Thomas and Doug might take as current and former commissioners. I don't know if Doug's in a situation or Chairman Thomas or.
I'm still here, but Ted, if you want Ted, go right ahead.
Though we don't have one in Arkansas, to me, having flexible and multiple options is really, really important because we don't know which way prices are going to go and we don't know which way technology is going to go. So to accommodate everything, and like Brad said, if something happens, you don't want to be rulemaking and litigating for 2 or 3 years. You want to be able to go straight to market. So to me, you want to be proactive and try to figure out what you can do to accommodate this and get rules in place beforehand. So if the policies come along, then you're ready to go to work rather than rule make and litigate.
And this is Doug. Just to add on to what Chairman Thomas said, from having been in a state, I was a commissioner in a restructured state that had a fairly substantial RPS, although it didn't include these kinds of projects. To get them included, obviously there's some legislative effort that would be needed, but then in terms of enforcing it, it really ends up pretty much the same. In most jurisdictions, the commission is the entity that's charged with making sure that either the vertically integrated utility or the distribution utility is meeting their RPS requirements, but so much of their load is meeting whatever the requirement is. Some states have set-asides for particular types of renewable energy, but that clearly comes within the job description of commissions, and it really doesn't matter if you're restructured or vertically integrated. The commissions where there is an RPS are still going to have the role of making sure that that's enforced. Now, in most places, if there's not a specific set aside, in this case for carbon capture projects, those laws are written fairly agnostically. But I think what Chairman Thomas said is really important. Having that available to different commissions to be able to help enforce is really, really important. And what we've seen from other renewables, you could talk about the production tax credit on the federal level, and that's obviously had a really important role with wind and the investment tax credit with solar. But I think you'll find in states that have robust RPSs that those were also significant drivers of renewable energy in their states. So I think the combination, like Brad's saying, and kind of going back to the theme of the first paper of putting the pieces together, I think if you have something fairly robust in terms of tax credits at the federal level combined with an RPS in the state, that could be really, really powerful in terms of incenting these projects to go forward.
Great, thank you. And then I just had one final question. I think Chairman Thomas mentioned figure 6 in the report, which is a graph of the cost per ton of carbon dioxide reduction for different technologies, including carbon capture. And so my question on that, and this might be more of a sort of plant-specific question, but what's the impact in general of the age of a coal plant on its sort of cost competitiveness for carbon capture? When we visited Petra Nova, that plant had been built in 1982, I believe, so almost 35 years old before the carbon capture system began operations. So does it really just depend on the characteristics of the plant and what sort of existing pollution controls they have? Does that kind of determine the suitability and the sort of cost competitiveness of carbon capture?
Who wants to take a crack at that one?
Sorry, it might be a little.
No, I mean I can start, and then if others want to jump in. Okay.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so obviously it is plant specific. It's not only the characteristics of the power plant in question, it's also its location relative to existing oil fields where there are oil companies ready and willing to purchase CO2 and to some extent pipeline infrastructure that's either available or can be fairly readily developed. So those are all kind of considerations. But at the plant level itself, I think especially for the first generation of carbon capture projects, those plants that will be the strongest candidates for retrofits will be those that have, without giving you a specific year, will be those with the longest economic life ahead of them. And also those units that either were built with very significant criteria pollutant controls or have retrofitted for them. So, I mean, sunk cost is usually thought of as a negative thing. But in this case, if you have a fairly new, efficient coal unit that has the sunk costs of having already invested in the retrofit pollution control technologies, that's going to be a stronger candidate than an older plant that's less efficient and doesn't have those basic or doesn't have to the same degree those investments in pollution control technologies. I'm just sort of laying that out as a general kind of some of the criteria that would come into play in thinking through. So just for example, in Chairman Thomas's state, I would think that if you're thinking about units to retrofit, the Turk plant is very well known. It's an ultra supercritical plant, extremely efficient. It's very new, and SWEPCO is going to want to run that power plant for as long as they possibly can in terms of the economic life ahead of it. But there may be another plant in that region which is older and requires all kinds of other investments, probably would be less likely.
Mm-hmm.
And to add to that, the Turk plant, incidentally, is closest to these older type oil fields than our other facilities in Arkansas.
And this is Doug. The only thing I would add, Brad is exactly right. And the reason that you're going to want the longer economic life of the plant is because there is going to be cost to install the retrofit equipment. And so just like with any other installation, you're going to want to have the time to depreciate that asset and to make full economic use of it, as well as to make the money back for as long as you can with the sale of the CO2. So to the extent that all of that is possible, then the greater economic life is. But it's like Brad said, there's not a one year of a formula, because if you're depending on where your location is, how close you are, what somebody's willing to pay for the CO2, you might have a better economic. The formula may work better for you, even if the life of the plant isn't quite as long as the place that will last longer, but it's further away from the oil field.
That's a good point. Just to add, that it just occurred to me, this is useful to mention here the whole pipeline infrastructure issue and the potential role that federal financing could play. Ideally, we want to get to a point where we have pipeline networks in this country where these geographical considerations aren't paramount. So I mentioned the Turk plant in Arkansas that, as Chairman Thomas pointed out, is very close to, relatively speaking, very close to existing large oil fields where EOR has been successfully demonstrated. But there are also large modern power plants in the upper Midwest that are substantially further from such fields that would be equally suitable for carbon capture retrofits, and ideally with build out of large scale CO2 pipelines to some of these regions that aren't presently served, generators and their regulators and state officials and all the folks that want to see these investments put to full use won't have the challenges of infrastructure that currently face now, because some of those pipeline corridors will be in place.
Yeah, an example of that, this is Doug again, an example of that, in southern Illinois, you've got the Prairie State plant, which is really, really new in terms of coal plants, with all of the modern equipment on it. When at the time it was built, I think it was completed right around 2010 or 11. But, you know, and it's in part southern Illinois too, so with the appropriate pipeline network to get to the Gulf Coast, for example, would not be all that much of a stretch. And there you've got a plant that's got a long operating lifetime possibility, as well as already having all the push control equipment on there. So you know, that's the kind of plant that if the pipeline network was there that Brad talked about, could really be ideal for this kind of a facility.
Great, thank you. I don't see any other questions, but last call, if anyone has one, please send it in the box or raise your hand. In the meantime, I'll go ahead and thank all of our panelists, Chairman Thomas, Matt Fry from Governor Meade's office, and Brad Crabtree and Doug Scott from the Great Plains Institute. Thank you very much all, and I will go ahead and end the webinar here.
Thank you, Kara. Thank you, commissioners.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.